Pastor Ed here with Daily Devotions for Saturday, June the 1st, 2024. I want to kind of wrap up this week of talking about the Bible by kind of going back to last Sunday and that whole question, where did Adam and Eve's children find wives to marry? And it reminds us of the inconsistencies that there are. In particular, you've probably heard how there's, and read, there's one account of creation in Genesis 1 and a very different one in Genesis 2. How can that be? Traditionally, it was believed that Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. The problem with that is that in the book of Deuteronomy, Moses dies. So how could you write about your own death? Somebody, a fellow by the name of Richard Simon, I'm taking this from a great online lecture I found, Yale Lectures Online, Professor Christine Hayes, talking about a Richard Simon, who was the first to argue that maybe Moses wasn't the one who wrote the entire Torah, those first 5 books. Then there was a fellow by the name of John Ostruck, who first noticed that the name of Yahweh in certain stories and passages and the name Elohim for God in others. And on this basis, he came to identify what has come to be known as the J and E sources, J being pronounced Y in German. So Yahweh is spelled with a J for that reason. So you get these J and E sources. And then in 1878, there's a classic statement on source theory published by a Julius Wellhausen. And he presented what's come to be known as the documentary hypothesis, basically saying that the historical and narrative sections of the Bible, the Old Testament at least, Genesis and stretching through 2 Kings, is comprised of 4 identifiable source documents that have been woven together in some way, and they date to different periods, reflect different interests and concerns. These 4 documents were woven together by somebody or some group of somebodies to form the narrative core of that the Bible, the Old Testament, from Genesis through 2 Kings. So the 4 sources that he identified are the J and the E, also a P or priestly source, and D, which is primarily the book of Deuteronomy. And so they were also able to attempt to date them. Now, this has kind of come into some debate in recent years, but it was felt that the J source came from around 1000 BC or BCE, the E source from maybe 900 BCE, and then you have 2 other sources, the D and the P. The D, of course, basically being the book of Deuteronomy, and that probably came around, it's believed, in the 600s BCE, and the priestly source, which is found mostly in Leviticus and the non-narrative portions of Numbers, where there's a great concern for religious institutions and the Sabbath and holidays, although it's also Genesis 1, that came about probably during the Babylonian captivity. And so these narrative parts of P, J, and E are accounts of the history, basically from creation of the world through Moses. And again, the theory is that the last one to be written, the priestly school, drew together all the older material, added some of its own editorial material in terms of bridges, introductions, conclusions, inserted priestly documents of Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and they did this after sitting in exile in Babylon. And so the first 5 books is really the result, it is argued, of 5 centuries of religious and literary activity, which is a very, very different portrait from the traditional claims about the authorship of one man, namely Moses. That's a lot. Maybe you've heard about this, maybe you haven't. The best way that I've come to think about it, Memorial Day, got together with my brother and my cousin Bill, came over from Pennsylvania. 3 of us sat together, and whenever we do that, we tend to swap stories, and didn't do so much on Memorial Day, but very often we'll talk about family history and our experiences growing up, and we'll always have like a slightly different take on it. I've mentioned this before. We have our own perspective, our own unique lens through which we remember and talk about things. And so think about the Bible in those terms. There's different people, and the Gospels are a good example of this in the New Testament. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, different perspectives, looking at the same events from a slightly different way. And so you also have to remember that both for the Old and the New Testament, there was a long period, for the Old Testament, literally centuries of oral tradition before anything was written down. And then it gets written down and it kind of gets woven together, the different stories, and they don't always match up really well. They try to do it, but there's just a lot of things, a lot of questions that are unanswered. That's what we're kind of doing in the Did You Ever Have a Question sermon series. But it just kind of gives you a sense of different perspectives. The other thing is that the idea that it was written by Moses is sort of something that you see in the New Testament with Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It's probably not likely that the biblical Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John actually wrote those Gospels. It was very common in those days to put a famous name onto a literary work so that people would read it. And you say, oh, but we still do that today. A lot of books written by well-known people really aren't written by those people. They're written by what we call today ghostwriters. And I've told this story before as well, but my cousin Lester Wells, Buddy Wells, was asked to ghostwrite a book on football. Now, Buddy Wells was not a big guy, didn't play football. Why would you read a book about football written by Buddy Wells? However, Kyle Rote was a famous football player, first in college at SMU. Then he played for the New York Giants. And when I was a kid growing up, he was a sportscaster on the evening news. Well, he was a big name about football. So they put Kyle Rote's name on the book. But Lester Wells, my cousin, is the one who actually wrote it. And so you have to look at the Bible in those terms as well, that you want people to read it, so you associate it with a famous person. You're bringing together, weaving together different traditions and perspectives that have come down over decades, if not centuries. And maybe that's not as clear cut and as we'd like it to be, as if that God somehow dictated it all. But there's a certain beauty in all that there's still this message comes through in all 66 books of God's. I talked about this earlier in the week, of the human condition, of God's unconditional love, and the way in which God reaches out to us in Jesus Christ and makes it possible to be reunited not only with God, but with each other as well. Just this wonderful unfolding story in the Bible, even though it's coming from all these different sources, it all comes down to one central message, which is so powerful and so important. Well, that's going to wrap it up for this week. We're going to have another Old Testament question, actually, that kind of relates to, in some ways, but somebody asked about why did Methuselah in the Bible live so long? Well, if you've probably heard the name Methuselah, you may not remember or know who it was. You'll find out about that and how it is that he possibly lived to be, as the Bible would indicate, 969 years. Not likely, so how can we understand and explain that? Try to do that tomorrow. Hope you can join us for worship, and hope you can join us again for daily devotions again on Tuesday. Till then, take care. Bye.